Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Justice Deal podcast, where we will be interviewing heterodox economists, researchers, and academics from South Africa and around the world on issues pertaining to climate change and climate justice from the perspective of their respective fields. I'm your host, Awande Buthelezi, and I am a researcher and organizer at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center and an activist with the Climate Justice Charter movement. The purpose of this podcast is to spotlight the climate justice deal, which will take the principles, perspectives, and alternatives put forward in the Climate Justice Charter and give them policy form. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ariel Salleh. Dr. Salleh is an Australian sociologist and ecofeminist writer who writes on humanity-nature relations, political ecology, social change movements, and ecofeminism. In today's discussion, we touched on a wide range of topics, but mainly the historical perspective of ecofeminism and the conceptual roots of the pluriverse and pluriversality. So I wanted to lead into two different questions, because I think they kind of both fit the moment where we are and this great way of making the psychological break that you've provided. One was the question of metabolism and the energy, and the other was the problem of ideological subsumation. Maybe I'll begin with the question of ideological subsumation.
Yes.
Because I think it leads on naturally from the question of praxis, the issue of praxis that you've raised right now. And you warn that people struggling for alternatives need to be aware of the ever-present risk of ideological subsumation. That under dominant global order, those in charge try to keep social protest movements a single issue, the opposites, going back to those binaries that you spoke about before. And that has led to an identity politics, particularly in the West, transatlantic democracies, which have kind of watered down discussions and debates around intersectionality. So what is this risk of ideological subsumation that you see? How does it pose a risk or problem, rather, for those who are trying to fight for alternatives? How can we guard against this?
I think the left, our dear friends on the left, are terribly naive about this question. Of course, many of them rush into the Green New Deal, and you and I know very well the multiple levels of problem with Green New Deal. And even this term intersectionality, which is so popular in the United States, it expresses liberalism. It expresses the 1-0 mindset of the sociological method, which splits society into separate groupings in order to analyze them and make them malleable for policy policy manipulation and so on and so on. And when I hear feminists talking about intersectionality, I just because in a sense ecological feminism was transcultural from the beginning, and it was cross-class from the beginning. It didn't matter. You've got corporate wives would be on the picket line striking for peace just as much as black mothers or working class Irish mothers or whoever, because the reproductive politics is not governed by the 1-0 logic. It's not governed by a distributional mindset. One of the problems with the problem with liberalism, and a large extent even to eco-socialism, it's framed by distributional logic. It assumes units, and the units have to be equally shared. But nature is not made of units. Well, Marcuse was very good. He talked about repressive tolerance. So, like, it's mainstream capitalist society gives the impression of taking on, it's your radical critique, but at the same time, it subverts it by subsuming and absorbing it back into capitalist processes. So we're seeing this all the time with environmental, as I mentioned, the Green New Deal would be a case, the circular economy would be a case in point, different kinds of feminism, mainly liberal feminism, is a case in point. The other thing, this society that we have, this dissociated, fractioning society which breaks everything into units and then remanipulates them. Like I said at the beginning, everything's got to be in a box. It thrives on creating distinctions and differences between people. It thrives on black versus white, or gay versus femme, or whatever. And this COVID narrative that has been orchestrating our lives for the last 2 years has succeeded in breaking society into fractions of, vax and anti-vax, and and this only plays into the hands of those with power, and the insecurity, the loneliness that it creates results in frustration and violence. And of course, we know that domestic violence has increased incredibly during the COVID period. I think huge figures in France and Australia, and I'm sure South Africa has the problem too. So I don't know. I'm a miserable bugger. I don't know. You don't want to talk to me.
I know. I think you provide a lot of clarity, because what you've just articulated is what a lot of people have the feeling of, but they don't have the words to describe. Our society is already alienated, but we find ourselves being further alienated in these various ways. These supposed tools that should be able to free us from alienation, or our particular group, whichever box we assign ourselves to or have been put in by society, those different markers then also get used to, further alienate us from being able to connect with others like us, or others who should be able to find some type of connection with who are not like us, which I think is the point, right? Is that we should be able to build those bridges to be able to allow for the many worlds and the many differences within this one. And I think that it's depressing to think about, but necessary to guard against, as you say, because we do have to find a way across these differences if we are going to meet the challenges of our time. You also spoke about energies earlier on, and I actually wanted to come to this also, that you use the term metabolism, metabolic rift, and metabolic value. What do these words mean, and what can they say about the differences between the global north and the global south, but also what do they say for how we live within our societies?
Yes. Let me go back to the point where I made a distinction between ecofeminism with an ecocentric frame versus some other versions of feminism with an anthropocentric frame. And I would include socialist feminism there. And what's so interesting is that in recent last year or so, the socialist feminists have picked up on the importance of reproductive labour. There's been a number of books out quite recently, although the idea of the importance of reproductive labour was already discussed by feminists, particularly Italian feminists in the 1970s, but and the fact that it's subsidised capitalism. But the new generation of feminists are running with this now. However, they are still only looking at reproductive labour in terms of the reproduction of human beings, reproduction of families, the reproduction of the infrastructure of capitalist economies and so forth, which women's domestic labour does provide for free. So with an ecocentric, ecofeminist, ecocentric frame, we look at reproductive labour in the ecosystem at large, and we look at how humans, who are nature in embodied form, our embodied energies are provided by nature. We take in nature's energies, we expel wastes, and that nature then revitalizes that, and the whole circle goes on. And this, Marx himself actually did identify humanity-nature metabolism. I believe he uses the word metabolism, perhaps not with an ecocentric frame. But there is a sense of this there. And when John Bellamy Foster, the celebrated eco-socialist theorist, talks about metabolic rift, and I think Marx mentioned it once somewhere in his writings, which is created by capitalism once it sets industrialization in place and urbanization, which takes from nature, takes from the rural areas, and depletes them. And so a rift is set up between the urban and the rural, just as a rift is set up in colonization between the global north and the global south, because the global north takes resources, both labor resources and natural resources, into itself from the global south, and it creates this appalling rift, this breakdown, which is part of the Anthropocene, even though it's not actually being very much discussed in that context. So now the question was, what do I understand by metabolism? Well, that's the metabolism of humanity and nature. Metabolism, I think I said earlier, it sort of has a dialectical logic. It's not a 1-0 logic. It's a flow logic. It deals with flows and reversals and continuity and transformation and peoples from pluriversal cultures, non-industrial cultures, are generally in touch with that logic, even if they're not speaking about it as a logic. Implicitly, that is understood, but in addition to that, as Vandana Shiva, a very celebrated ecofeminist Indian, has pointed out, in fact, many development scholars have dependency theorist scholars have pointed out that it's the labours of farmers, mainly women farmers in the global south, which is producing 80% of the world's food. And as I said, they actually are creating the infrastructure for the whole modern system that we're living in. So in a sense, they actually have power. They're a global majority class. If they withdrew their, if they found a strategy for withdrawing from the system would collapse. So in a sense, I suggest that there is another class which Marxist class analysis needs to take account of, which is this meta-industrial class, this class outside of industrialization, but yet whose labours are responsible from making industrial productivism possible. So metabolism, meta-industrial labour, meta-industrial class, and the only other term that I often use in this context is again to try to embody this materialist analysis, and to try to emphasize the fact that humans are nature in embodied form, that labour is a form of holding, whether it's the holding of a mother holding the infant child, or the holding of a son to his mother, not dissociated, or the holding of a forest ecosystem, because that's where the people gather their needs. It's that ecological holding is a form of systems analysis. The labours that Indigenous peoples are doing in their subsistence or gathering labours is holding. It's scientific work. It's how can I say? It's nurturing a system. So I think that's it.
I think that's a really brilliant concept in terms of understanding really what it is that is being done. Like it's nurturing, and it really is holding is the best way of describing what's actually happening, how you're nurturing a system. And I think it's very inherent that it's also a very qualitative concept, that holding labor. So I just wanted to actually, just my final question is that just to then speak about that distinction, between that and, as you mentioned before and alluded to, the quantitative nature of other left-wing or progressive perspectives, particularly when we're talking about the Green New Deal and the eco-socialist perspectives. I think now that we have this concept of holding, can we also just go deep into that kind of difference between this qualitative but very accurate conception introduced with holding and this kind of dominant quantitative perspective that we find ourselves? Because, when you look at the Green New Deal material and those who are proponents of the Green New Deal, even though they are well-meaning in saying this, they also, as you're saying right now, that there is that kind of, interest in care work that has come to the fore in social reproduction, and they talk about adding it into the formal economy. Can you just go deeper into those differences? I think that'll also be quite useful in the ways in which we think moving forward about these projects and what kind of projects that we require to make the necessary breaks with the system.
Yeah, it's actually an epistemological project. I mean, it's a critique of the epistemology of modernity, but that epistemology has psychosomatic root. It has libidinal roots, which are material roots, which are embodied material roots. So, yeah, you could do a drawing, I guess, and join all the dots up or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. One day, I thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to somebody who really appreciates these ideas and who might play around with them a bit.
I've learned a lot from reading your work, engaging with these ideas and these concepts. They've challenged me, and they've also challenged some of my thinking with regards to where we are right now and the alternative route we can take, which also protects life, safeguards the planet that we have. I thank you for your time, and I also thank you for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. And let me just emphasize how important praxis is. All my life, I've probably been more time spent in activism in different social movements, struggles, than across the board. I mean, like, my purpose is to find a common denominator for workers, women's, Indigenous and ecological struggles. And I think we're getting there with some of these concepts. I think it's helping to bring them back to a common root and then a common strategy.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the CJ Deal podcast. And for more information on the Climate Justice Charter, please visit www.cjcm.org.za. And you can find us on Twitter at CJ Charter SA.